Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on improving stress resilience with plant medicine. I'm Johnny with St. Francis Herb Farm. You can tell by my shirt. And I'll be Dr. Brianna's sidekick for tonight. Dr. Brianna Lutz is a registered herbalist and naturopathic doctor based in Edmonton, Alberta. With an expertise in botanical medicine, she educates on the clinical application of herbs as a medical consultant for St. Francis Herb Farm. I've had many pleasures of help Brianna host these webinars with Healthy Planet, and we've had a lot of success in the past. Been a lot of fun, a lot of great questions. So I'm going to pass on the floor to Dr. Brianna.
Great. Thanks, Johnny. I'll just run through a couple housekeeping items just because I see something in the chat about it being not loud enough. I just want to confirm if kind of universally everybody can see and hear us okay. If you can see my slides, pop into the chat just to make sure majority of people can hear us. Okay, fabulous. Okay, so if there's a connection issue or a sound issue or buffering or anything on your end, definitely pop it in the chat if there's an issue. But if in general we're doing well, all the AV stuff is working effectively, then there will be a recording, obviously, of this presentation, and Johnny can share with y'all how you can access that. So as Johnny mentioned, I'm a naturopathic doctor. So we're going to get into, yes, definitely the lens of plant medicine, but certainly I do want to talk about some background in terms of why we're using certain botanical medicines. So you really have a context of stress resilience with plant medicine, what stress resilient means and looks like for people. So any kind of commentary, or if you want to say where you're coming from in the chat, certainly you can use that for that. We do have a separate Q&A box that you can feel free to pop your questions in throughout the presentation. I know there's already questions in there, and certainly if it's in the Q&A box, it allows me to either answer live with those questions. Sometimes I know I'm going to come up to that in a future slide or kind of a future topic, and I'm going to be answering that question anyways. But also if, sorry, I just got distracted by the chat there. Ideally I'll save some time at the end for questions, but historically there's many a question, and so I'm staying on a little bit longer to answer those questions if there's anything outstanding. But I do want to be respectful of your time, and definitely for the content that I want to go through, I want to make sure that we're able to get through all that. But certainly I want this to be interactive, and I want you to, because again, we're webinars. I know I try and engage as much as possible, and Johnny's great for keeping me on track and kind of keeping me in the loop with all of you attendees. But yeah, feel free to engage throughout the presentation. So this is your information and your presentation as well. Okay, so, and I am just fighting off a cold, so if I need to mute myself to clear my throat, or I have my water here, that I can do that. So we're going to be talking about the circadian rhythm. So this is essentially like our daily rhythm, and we will talk about what this means from a hormonal perspective. So what are the different hormones associated with the circadian rhythm, and how can we optimize this from a lifestyle perspective, but B, also how we can utilize or harness this with plant medicine. Adaptogens 101, I know sometimes this can go over people's heads a little bit, so I really want to bring it down to kind of the core concepts of how these adaptogens or these classifications of herbs are working on cortisol. And from there, then we'll get into different products from a stress and or a sleep perspective, and how that pertains to kind of the initial topics that we're going over, and how we can maybe utilize these products going forward. Okay, so buckle in, because I oftentimes have a very simple visual and then I talk a lot about what that means to kind of the context again of how all these herbs are working. Now, I really want to have a good conversation around cortisol, because especially like in the wellness sphere, we have a really negative connotation of cortisol and our various stress hormones. Okay. But cortisol is an absolutely necessary hormone in the body. So we don't need to necessarily fear cortisol. And cortisol is going to be responsible for the circadian rhythm. Okay, so it functions ideally not only when it's in balance, but following a particular rhythm. So, cortisol, as a necessary hormone in the body, is going to be responsible for things like regulating inflammation. It's going to be responsible for regulating blood pressure. So, you go from going from sitting to standing. Cortisol helps to regulate your blood pressure in that regard. Cortisol is going to be important for our stress response, and again, kind of the circadian rhythm or daily rhythm. Now, where we're getting into the context of like where cortisol can be negative or non-beneficial is more so based on talking about prolonged stressors. Now, short-term stressors, where we're kind of activating this immediate stress response. So when we're talking about epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline and noradrenaline, this is a necessary thing for survival again, right? But where the issue is if we don't have a resolution from those acute stressors, or B, that's happening and we have a prolonged reaction, which is where cortisol, or that kind of long-term stress hormone, is trying to pick up the slack from that. So when people are living in that like chronic fight or flight, or chronic sympathetic dominance, what we call, again, that can have negative implications on our cortisol. Now, when there's this dysregulation in cortisol, it's also going to affect other hormonal systems. Okay, so this prolonged stress or this dysregulation of cortisol, talked about, it's responsible for regulating inflammation. It's responsible for regulating your immune system. So when we have these prolonged stressors that are affecting our cortisol, we can see negative impacts on our immune system. So whether this be, say, an underfunctioning of our immune system, maybe this is an overactivity of our immune system where we're seeing like autoimmune conditions coming up. The next thing that cortisol can really affect, and from a short-term stress hormone response, or B, a prolonged cortisol issue, memory. We saw a lot of this in practice last week, where people think, they come to me and they're like, I feel like I have early onset Alzheimer's or early onset dementia, but I know contextually what's going on in their life right now, and say really high stress. And again, that really high stress or prolonged stress can actually shut off different memory centers. So whether that be memory consolidation, memory retrieval, etc., can have an effect there. Now, we also see it affecting hormonal systems like our insulin response, right? So if we have and cortisol and insulin are very intimately connected. So if we have, again, that dysregulation of cortisol or prolonged stressors that affect our cortisol levels, we can see altered insulin response. So we have a dysregulation of our blood sugar, and we can see this affecting other hormones. Our thyroid being really intimately connected to cortisol. I like to talk about thyroid being kind of like the brake pedal. So it's trying to slow our system down so we can recover and replenish, but we typically don't listen. So we push it into overdrive. Or even our reproductive hormones like follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone, which are responsible for estrogen production, testosterone production, egg development, and or sperm production as well. So it can have negative impacts in all of these hormonal systems too. So what I really want people to understand is that there's this regular rhythm of cortisol. So this should normally be high in the morning or peak in the morning. And this is the hormone that's going to get you out of bed in the morning. Okay. Then what's going to happen is cortisol is going to gradually decline over the day and help ease ourselves into sleep. Now, if you'll notice here, the drop or the lowest point of cortisol is actually when melatonin looks to rise. So our own natural production of melatonin. So if cortisol doesn't go down in the evening, we're not producing melatonin that's going to be supportive for a restful sleep. Same thing if we're not producing adequate amounts of melatonin and that's dropping, then we might see conversely an alteration or an effect with our cortisol the next day. So when anybody is coming to me for energy support, sleep maintenance or onset insomnia, I'm looking at and thinking about this picture when it comes to this circadian rhythm and how can I look to optimize this. And oftentimes I'm focusing on not only cortisol, but I'm also really focusing on their sleep because that is going to have a beneficial effect for this cortisol regulation as well. So when we look at supporting our cortisol, an interesting aspect when we look at our daily rhythm or the circadian rhythm, it's actually 24 and a half hours. And you're like, Brianna, like do the math, that doesn't make any sense. And they've actually done really interesting studies with this where they've put a bunch of people in a cave, I want to say for like 30 days, so no light exposure. And what they noticed is that these individuals started to wake up half an hour later every single day until they completely shifted their circadian rhythm. So what resets this 24 and a half hour circadian rhythm or clock gene is actually going to be light exposure. So one of the ways that we can look to support our cortisol is looking at this morning sunlight exposure. Now you're like, and especially with daylight savings, you're probably like, I wake up for work and it's not light out. That's very cute. Like, good job with getting that sunlight exposure. So how can we mimic that, right? How can we biohack our own physiology? So sometimes this is with a happy light or something that we're looking to increase this light exposure. And a happy light again can be like 15 to 20 minutes while you're having your coffee, 15 or 20 minutes while you're journaling or like your mindfulness practice, whatever that looks like for you. And or just like how we're generally supporting our light in our house, right? So any way that we can get light exposure, because that is going to help to drop our melatonin and allow our cortisol to rise. Now, when we're addressing energy, sleep, and stress, we have to focus on both that cortisol and melatonin picture. And then addressing cortisol is also going to be really tied to our nervous system, which we'll get into a little bit. But again, from a hormonal perspective, cortisol and insulin are very intimately connected. So how do we look at balancing blood sugar for better insulin regulation? My general rule to people is whenever you eat, think fiber, protein, and healthy fat. Because healthy fat and fiber and protein is going to prolong how quickly we actually break down glucose or our carbohydrates. And that will look to give us a gradual rise in blood sugar and avoid spikes and crashes. Spikes and crashes with your blood sugar is probably one of the worst things that we can do for our insulin. So it's not total, sugar reduction from our nutrition. Again, lowering that's going to be beneficial. But if somebody is going for like a Caramilk or whatever your thing of choice, I always tell people, have a little bit of like protein, fiber, healthy fat with that, so you're not getting that huge spike and crash in your blood sugar. Now, one of the biggest things I like to talk about in practice is going to be high protein in the morning. And this is really impactful. And I know this can get into the context of intermittent fasting, and it can get really complicated and really fancy. But my biggest thing is it's not necessarily when you break the fast, but it's how. Okay. And how we break that fast is going to be high protein, right? Because we don't want to give you like a bolus or a huge amount of carbohydrate or sugar that's going to crank up your glucose and then make insulin chase it. And even high protein in the morning is going to help stabilize or set point our blood sugar management for the rest of the day. So this is probably the most impactful meal when it comes to protein intake. And I'd say from like a Western society, we kind of invert this where we have more carbohydrate dominant breakfasts. And then our dinner usually has some type of a protein, or we're more conscious of including a protein later in the day. But again, flip-flopping that and getting that high protein in the morning is going to lower that insulin, so you have a better cortisol response. And then again, insulin's not chasing our blood sugar around throughout the day, and therefore cortisol doesn't have to react to that as well. Now, contextually, when I say high protein, how much protein is high protein? 30 grams. 30 grams of protein is usually what we're trying to reach. And just for context, 2 eggs are about 12 grams of protein. So most people aren't hitting that target. And so oftentimes in practice, we're talking through strategies of bumping up that protein in the morning. And we have a lovely dietitian on our staff that's really also helpful for giving people those meal ideas. But again, really focusing on that high protein. Now, stress management and nervous system regulation is also key. So if we can shift our system out of that constant fight or flight, or shift people out of that sympathetic dominance, then we don't have that constant dysregulation of those short-term stress hormones. And that doesn't have as much of an impact on cortisol. So this can be through a number of different ways. And this could be through exercise. Exercise is also beneficial for insulin management, but whatever that looks like for somebody. The best, and so research says, what is the best exercise for people? And the answer is the one that you'll do. Okay. So whatever that looks like, incorporating movement throughout your day. I'm a big fan of getting people to focus on strength training, again, because there's so many additional benefits with insulin management and hormones. And that's what I deal with a lot in my practice. Low intensity, steady state, or LISS activity. So 30 minutes of walking with your heart rate under 135 is beneficial for your cortisol, blood sugar management, metabolism. So whenever you can fit that in your day, and then whatever exercise type you're going to be consistent with. And consistency is usually where we find the biggest success with any type of movement. And mindfulness, right? So whatever that looks like for you, and that might not be meditation. That's okay. You can pick activities that promote like this singleness of mind. For some people, that's playing with their dog. For some people, that's pottery. For some people, that is journaling or maybe meditation or yoga. Honestly, wherever we can, getting massage, wherever we can just shift and settle our nervous system, I think is going to be really, really important for people. We can't look at stress without looking at our nervous system and nervous system regulation. And I'll talk about that from a herbal context as well. Then routine and sleep management. Your body loves routine. And I always talk about this when it comes to digestion. Like one of the quickest, easiest, cost-free hacks for your digestion is eating at the same time every day. Okay. Your body loves routine, and it has a better chance at trying to mount this hormonal regulation, mount this preparedness for what you're about to do if there's a bit more of a routine. So whether that be, waking up at the same time every day, a bedtime. Yes, adults need bedtime too. And I'm a revenge procrastination sleep time girly too. So I just need to be really conscious of like sleep management and a bedtime. And then what does this look like from a sleep hygiene perspective? I'm just gonna, from a sleep hygiene perspective, we'll talk about melatonin and how we can support melatonin in a second. But yeah, from that sleep management, the sleep hygiene, ways to help with that melatonin production. could be things like altering our light exposure throughout the day. So I'm just going to bump to the next slide. I know there's questions, and I think after this slide, there'll be a nice natural transition to answer that. Yeah, I see some comments about yoga, pickleball, heading to the gym, swimming, sauna. I love like temperature, like regulate. I'm so happy that like cold plunging is becoming like very like cool, because naturopathic doctors have been talking about hydrotherapy and temperature regulation for decades, if not centuries. So I'm happy that this is becoming more mainstream. I think that's really important. Okay, so sleep hygiene. Now this can be your wind down routine, your book, your meditation, your stretching, whatever that looks like, your skincare routine. But from a biohacking perspective, I know some people don't love that term. I love it. How do we work with your natural physiology? Sleeping in a cool room. Okay. The lowering of your body temperature will actually look to shift or support melatonin production. Like this is a physiological thing. We even have graphs of like your body temperature, your core temperature. As it shifts down, conversely, your melatonin is rising. So there is true merit in this, where sleeping in a cool room is going to be better for your own melatonin production. Sleeping in a dark room also has the same impact. Light exposure, remember, is going to increase that cortisol. So the darker our room can be, so take out those alarm clocks with the lights, with the TV, anything that we can do to create that dark atmosphere, blackout blinds, whatever that looks like, I think is really important. And they've actually done studies where they've shone a light on the back of somebody's knee and just watch their melatonin production decline. Like something as insignificant as that can have a huge impact on your own melatonin production. So I really like, and if you've ever stayed at like a bougie hotel and they have like this wind down routine, or kind of like how it's adjusting, like this I can't remember the term of like changeover service. What we want to do is start to change your light exposure throughout the evening in this preparation for bed. So that video of like never ever use the overhead lights, that's true. Turn off the overhead lights or pop them on a dimmer. Use table lamps or softer lights, or something with a more warm wavelength, candles, fire, whatever that looks like. And so it's kind of like your evening light. And in this same context, start avoid like the use of blue light. So what's coming from all of our screens, right? Our phone, our laptop, our iPads, and you can install apps that look to take away the blue light. There's one called Flux. I've used that previously, which is a free app for your computer. Some people wear blue light blocking glasses if they have to be on blue light technology on technology that has blue light. I work with a lot of, say, photographers where they're editing and they need proper representation of light again. So we have some ways of working around that. Again, blue light blocking glasses could be an option if you have to be on a screen at that time. A regular bedtime. Again, your body loves routine. And what's really interesting is the hours of sleep before midnight can be actually some of the most substantial and crucial for the quality of our sleep. And we'll talk a little bit about sleep architecture, but again, like going to bed at 1 o'clock or 1 a.m. and then staying up till or sleeping till 10 is going to have less of a benefit than, say, going to bed at 11 and then having the same amount of hours of sleep. And again, all of this information and data is based off of like a solar cycle, right? So this might be different for people who are working like night shift. And again, we're flip-flopping and we're trying to support their own circadian rhythm as best as we can. And shift work is a whole nother thing. I'd say like shift work is one of the hardest things to help support, because there's so much that people are losing out on potentially for their own benefits, or their healing with their sleep, or their own natural production of melatonin, or their own regulation of cortisol. So sometimes we need to be a little bit more hands-on in that regulation as well. So regulating your nervous system with a wind down routine, preparing for the next day, packing your kids' lunches, maybe laying out your clothes, getting your gym bag ready. This is like biggest hack ever. Make sure your gym bag is packed the night before, because then you have no excuses to go the next day. Or lay your workout shoes next to your Peloton, or take those shoes and be prepared for the next day. Whatever that looks like for you. And maybe it's looking at your meetings or your client bookings the next day, or the errands you have to run, and having a bit of a mental plan. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily resonate with journaling, but what I found to be effective of a recommendation is just a brain dump. So all of those things that you will probably be thinking about when you're trying to fall asleep, all of those things that you'll wake up, that will wake you up at 2 a.m., be like, oh, I have to remember to talk to Jim about this client. Write all of that down before you go to bed, because your brain will constantly try and remind you. So if it's put, you don't have to think about it, and then you can focus more so on sleep. Some people are looking at gentle movement or stretching. I know some people were talking about Tai Chi. Honestly, whatever that looks like for you. And then breathing meditation. Again, these are accessing your nervous system, right? If we can regulate your nervous system, then we're going to have a more beneficial effect on your cortisol and your cortisol regulation. Getting out of that sympathetic dominance, not living in that constant fight or flight. Okay. Okay, so there's some questions in regards to like sleep issues related to stress, and then some product specific stuff that I'll get to kind of in that section. But for stress management, in particular with exercise, is there an optimal time of day to exercise or do strength training? Honestly, for me, it's just whenever people can fit it in. Now, there's some like associations with, say, like high intensity or like HIIT training being, say, non-beneficial in the evening or closer to where you want to go to sleep, just because you're more stimulated, and it might take a little bit longer for your body to wind down. So sometimes I'm recommending your more restorative types of practices like yoga, or those kinds of things in the evening. Maybe strength training even in the evening if you're doing like progressive loading, or you're doing again, heavier sets or that kind of thing. But if there's more, say, high intensity or higher cardio, sometimes those are better in the earlier morning, just to help stimulate the support your kind of cortisol rhythm. But there's nothing necessarily in particular that you have to adhere to. And usually I'm asking people, are you more energized after that activity? And if so, is that beneficial, or does that interfere with your sleep? And usually in talking about workouts with people, we don't want you to feel more depleted after a workout. You can feel depleted during a workout, which means you're probably using the correct weight. You're probably striving with the correct intensity. But the recovery piece shouldn't be a day, shouldn't be 2 days. Soreness, yes, I can see that, but recovery shouldn't be prolonged. And so you probably need to decrease that intensity if the negative effects are really prolonged. Sometimes we talk about that like being an issue with cortisol, that we don't have that good recovery. So looking to downscale that. Okay, so I answered that.
And there were also a few that had asked in the chat if the happy lights were actually beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I don't know if there's a specific wavelength that you want to necessarily adhere to, but I know like the happy lights are great. And I feel like Costco usually does a run this time of year. So they're more affordable. And again, wherever you can find that, certainly like 15 to 20 minutes is all you need with that happy light, like first thing in the morning. Yeah. Great. I love seeing people's activity. Turn down service. Yes, that's the word I was looking for. Yeah, makes you want to go to bed. Yeah, your bed is freshly made. You got your tea going. Yeah, all great. I love a good turn down service. Okay. Now, again, I don't want to get too technical, too jargony here, but I really want people to understand how adaptogens or how these things are working to support our cortisol. And then we'll talk about kind of the herbs associated with that. Now, these constituents, and again, this is kind of chemically, so steroidolactones, triterpenes, steroidal saponins, beta glucans. So you'll see kind of a thread or a theme with that is steroid based, right? So adaptogens and a lot of adaptogens are going to be kind of steroidal in nature, which is essentially what cortisol is. Cortisol is a steroid based hormone. So we have that steroid backbone and then we create different hormones from that. So adaptogens and these kind of key constituents are actually starting to mimic or support cortisol within our system. Now, what I also think is important in the context, and you don't need to remember these names, but what I think is important with these constituents is all constituents need some type of a solvent, okay? Teas where we get nice volatile oils do really well with water. These types of molecules do need a higher solvent. So we're actually looking at probably an alcohol base, which is what St. Francis does. There are alcohol extractions or tinctures, okay? So when we're talking about like a powdered ashwagandha that we're tossing into a smoothie or these kinds of things, are you actually extracting these different steroid-based things that work on cortisol? You might not be, unless it's a standardized extraction that product has already done. But if you were to just take ashwagandha root, garble it up, and toss it in a smoothie, you might not be getting as beneficial effects on cortisol. Now, there are different constituents like flavonoids that are pretty readily available from like a smoothie or a water extraction. And those can have an indirect effect on cortisol because it's working as an antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. But if we really want to target this cortisol, an alcohol extraction or a standardized extraction where we're looking to achieve or have a good level of these different constituents is actually quite important. Now, when we're looking at the ways that adaptogens will work in our system, to understand how hormones work, you can think about it as like a lock and a key. Okay, so cortisol is the key and it needs to go to its lock. So when we're looking at different things that may say bind to this lock or work on this lock or this receptor site for cortisol, these different adaptogens can mimic cortisol structure and bind to these cortisol receptors. So they're not identical to cortisol. They aren't molecularly completely similar, but they can have a more loose binding, which gives us what we call a partial agonist or a bit of a balancing effect. So if cortisol is really high in our body, and again, this likes to tightly bind to those receptors, if we have something that loosely binds to that receptor, sometimes it can kick off other things like high cortisol, so it can actually look to lower that cortisol response in people. Alternatively, if somebody's cortisol is really low, and we have these molecules that mimic or are very similar to cortisol, they can have that loose binding and then produce a similar or a similar action essentially to cortisol. So that's how a lot of them are working, especially if they have that steroid-based structure or those steroid-based kind of constituents. Now, another way that these are working is they actually prevent the breakdown of cortisol. So I like to just give a comparison because a lot of people understand like how antidepressants work. So antidepressants or SSRIs prevent the reuptake of serotonin. So the serotonin just kind of lives around longer. So we have more of a happy effect with that hormone. So we can achieve something quite similar in cortisol, where we prevent the breakdown of cortisol, so it's around longer, so we have a more beneficial effect, and then it also spares or reduces the demand on the adrenal gland to continually output cortisol. So some examples of this, like licorice actually has this component that's going to prevent those enzymes from breaking down cortisol. Rehmannia is another herb that also has a similar effect. Other ways that adaptogens can work is they act on the feedback mechanisms of our stress cycle. So our brain talks to the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands are what makes cortisol. And then again, these hormones, we have feedback to the brain to tell us, do we need more, do we need less? Kind of like a furnace, right? If it's really hot, your furnace is going to shut off instead of continually pumping out heat. So we can have an effect on this negative feedback loop to the brain and tell it like, it's okay. We don't need more cortisol. We're not in this stress cycle. Like, don't make any more. We're good. So these I would associate with being like very calming adaptogens. So something like ashwagandha we'll talk about can work on that negative feedback loop and tell the brain like, we good, like you don't need to make additional cortisol. Now, it can work on other pathways that have a secondary or indirect effect on cortisol. So a lot of things that we talk about, like flavonoids, or these things are looking to decrease inflammation. If we're decreasing inflammation, this has a bit of a regulatory component with cortisol, less inflammation, less demand for cortisol. So that can have a beneficial effect if we're working on these other pathways, kind of an indirect effect on cortisol. And what's also interesting is they can actually work on mitochondrial energy transfer. So if you think back to like grade 6 science, whenever that was, where you learn about the cell, and mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. That's what makes our energy. So we actually have adaptogens that work on mitochondria to help produce more energy. So this might be more of a stimulating adaptogen. So something like rhodiola could be a stimulating adaptogen. It works on mitochondria as well. Okay. So I'm not, again, features what we would be looking for: resilience and ability to adapt to stress, sustains energy, enhances learning, memory, physical endurance, healing, immunity, and recovery. And then again, that mitochondria as well. Okay. So now I'm going to get into products, see how we're doing for time. Perfect. Just a question: is it safe for our eyes to look at happy light? Should we wear sunglasses when sitting in front of it? No, we actually want full exposure with our eyes. Same thing in the morning, like when you actually do have sunlight and you go outside, don't wear sunglasses because the light exposure or the down regulation of melatonin happens through actually activity in the eye. You don't have to like stare directly at it. Like you could be journaling and then it's on your face and you're kind of glancing up. You don't need to stare at it like an eclipse, but you don't need to cover your eyes or avoid that. Oops. Okay, answer live. Okay, is there a way to measure cortisol and melatonin levels in our body? So cortisol is I'm not aware of any melatonin ways of testing melatonin aside from urine metabolites. So you can do urine tests, look for the breakdown products of melatonin. Cortisol can be tested in blood, saliva, urine. Usually as a blood test. It's generally ruling in or out a condition related to cortisol. So like overt diseases. From a functional perspective, I actually like seeing the pattern of cortisol. So if it's kind of going down and it's not realistic to do blood spots like multiple times a day. So in that case, some people are looking at salivary or urine testing to measure that. Okay. All right. So stressed. Very appropriately named, but again, we're looking at these adaptogens from that cortisol regulation, right? So this is going to feature ashwagandha plus 5 other key adaptogenic herbs: rhodiola, Siberian ginseng, holy basil, and schisandra. Milky oat seed, I would more so classify as a nervine or support for the nervous system, which I think is very important from this formulation, right? Because we talked about how not only is cortisol important, but so is the nervous system. And it's kind of like chasing our tails a little bit if we don't address both. So I really like this formulation because, again, there's a lot of like really stimulating adaptogen blends on the market, where this is a very like restorative and supportive formulation for both cortisol and our nervous system. Again, so we're completing that cycle or being conscious of all of the factors that can contribute to cortisol dysregulation. Now, when we might consider this, so again, we talked about that cortisol regulation. Could it be even just for circadian rhythm and support of your daily rhythm of cortisol? Sometimes we're looking at this for people with, say, either short-term or whether that be prolonged stressors, especially where there's increased stress and demand for mental performance. You see that a lot in students, people meeting certain deadlines. We can also see this in athletes, and arguably like a lot of people are athletes and they don't even realize they're athletes based on their activity level and how they need to fuel, because you have to think about exercise as being a stress on the body. It is a beneficial stress, but we want to make sure that we're fueling and recovering appropriately, or else that can be a prolonged stress on the body. But again, high endurance athletes or people where we're wanting to mitigate any physical stress on the body with increased exercise, that could be an option as well. People going through a particularly stressful time. Johnny and I were just talking about how now till the end of the year is a grind for a lot of people. Like it gets busier and busier leading up to the holidays. I know it's kind of like back to school, and then things settle down a little bit, and then Christmas is starting like October 29th now. So again, people are kind of geared towards the end of the year. So it can be in those either short-term stressors, or there's a prolonged stressor that could be useful as well. And or say past use of corticosteroids, where there was a demand on cortisol within the system, or dysregulation of cortisol, barring there's no contraindications for those individuals to recover from that. So personally, I like dosing to mimic the cortisol curve. So I do recommend using say like when you first wake up, help support that cortisol. And then maybe there's a second dose like before lunch or early afternoon that just help guiding that cortisol curve a little bit more. And then we have this in tincture format, we have this in capsule format. And again, you can follow the dosing instructions on the label, but then we're just adjusting it to when the best time to take it is. And again, ideally with that cortisol curve. Sometimes I'll do like a double dose first thing, more support for cortisol, and then that second dose is kind of like a one dose or a half dose. Because if you're taking it say 3 times a day, I might do 2 capsules one, and then 1 capsule to again follow that cortisol curve. So you could again follow the dosing instructions and adjust per your day.
My favorite product.
What's that?
This is my favorite product.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's awesome. And I know like as a student, we were told like be on your adaptogens, like make sure you're on them again for stress management and that cortisol regulation, memory, and how all of those other things affect mental performance, all of those things. I think it's a really, really beneficial product. So Johnny's the champion of stress.
I take it heading into stressful days, or if I know I'm going to have a stressful meeting. And sometimes you feel it like right away. Like if I'm feeling anxious or stressed and I take a shot at that.
Yeah.
You're like, whoa, like, okay, I feel everything kind of regulating internally a bit. So
Yeah, totally. And I think that's also speaking to like some of the nervines or nervous system support within this formulation. Because sometimes when we're using herbs that have that like steroid base, it might take a little bit longer to notice those effects or have an accumulative effect on your body. But with the addition of these different nervine herbs, you're going to notice that on your nervous system like right away. Like Johnny said, like as soon as you take it, you just notice that it just brings you down a notch. And then the milky oat seed as a nervine, it's also very restorative for the nervous system too. So like that fried or frenetic or anxious kind of thing, it's really good at grounding people too. I just want to talk briefly about contraindications. So not for the use while pregnant or breastfeeding. And then also there just direct your attention to some mental health diagnoses like bipolar disorder. If somebody's on antidepressants, it would be contraindicated. The reason being is that rhodiola has a really beneficial effect on serotonin. So sometimes that in conjunction with an antidepressant, there's too much serotonin, and that would be, again, contraindicated if somebody's on those particular antidepressants. And then same thing with like birth control or hormone replacement therapy. Rhodiola is what we call a SERM, or a selective estrogen receptor modulator. So it has beneficial effects for estrogen, but if somebody's on HRT, hormone replacement therapy, or birth control, this would potentially be contraindicated. So you can always bring that up with a prescribing physician or somebody who knows both herbs and pharmaceuticals like an ND. Those are the primary ones I want to go over. Usually people with like heart or blood pressure, blood thinning medications, they're reading those cautions and warnings, which again are some of the contraindications, but just wanted to draw your attention there. Okay. So ashwagandha, we had briefly mentioned this in regards to the stressed, but we do have it as a single. So our capsule, we also have this as a liquid single, but I do want to talk a little bit more about our capsules. So this is a high potency 12-to-1 powder extract, standardized to 5% with analytes. And this is featuring the KSM 66 ashwagandha, so a full spectrum extraction with the highest concentration of constituents based on all like major root kind of extractions, and also one of the most well studied, because they have had this KSM 66 and then have done different clinical trials with this as well. As I mentioned previously, this is I associate it with being more of a calming adaptogen. So again, that feedback on that nervous system to the brain, telling it we good, we don't need to make more cortisol. So when people are describing themselves as being like wired and tired, I'm like, let's talk about ashwagandha. And this not only works on cortisol, but this is also really beneficial for sleep, both sleep onset and sleep maintenance insomnia, meaning it's hard to fall asleep, or you can fall asleep just fine and you're waking up throughout the night. So it can be beneficial for both. Some additional benefits: enhances memory and cognitive function. There's some really good research in Alzheimer prevention, and can help maintain normal thyroid as well. So again, especially if cortisol is affecting the thyroid, but ashwagandha can help support thyroid function as well. So just to highlight some of the studies that have been done with this extraction, is that they've shown that it reduces serum or blood cortisol by almost 28%. So especially say that high evening cortisol, where people are like, they're exhausted, they've dragged themselves through their day, and then it's like 9 o'clock at night, and they're like, I'm going to write my thesis and take my dog for a walk and pack the lunches and do 6 loads of laundry and da-da-da-da. Like, that's when we want to calm down the cortisol, like, again, suppress that and help ease us into a more restful sleep. So additional benefits when it comes to supporting sleep: so significantly shorter time falling asleep, significantly improved sleep efficiency, sleep quality, and has a more beneficial effect for, again, kind of calming and reduction of nervousness. So cortisol is one thing. Then when we talk about, say, the sleep cycle, this is where we're getting into really interesting things with sleep architecture, how sleep actually functions. So melatonin is just one part of the picture. But what happens with our sleep cycle is we'll move through these different phases. So sleep or stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and then REM sleep. And I know I talked about previously, like the hours before midnight. we might have longer of certain stages which have additional benefits for us, whether that be recovery, whether that be our immune system. And then say closer to when we'd wake up in the morning, we'll have longer REM sleep. And that's actually why we'll remember our dreams, because we have more prolonged REM sleep closer to when we're waking up. Now, GABA, which is a calming brain chemical or calming hormone, works to actually guide us through sleep architecture. So not only the onset of sleep, so allowing us to fall asleep, but then also maintaining or guiding us through the sleep architecture to keep us asleep. So ashwagandha is going to work on this GABA to help promote this sleep architecture for ideally keeping us asleep, and then also notably getting the benefit of these different stages. Because even if you're doing like an over-the-counter sleep aid, or some people like don't do well with melatonin, or people's medications, or some people are using alcohol to self-medicate with sleep, where we're using these sedatives or depressants on our nervous system, you might not get this actual benefit of all of these different stages of sleep for more of this restorative aspect, and maybe not as many beneficial effects on your circadian rhythm and your cortisol regulation the next day. So when we look at other herbs that can potentially do this, we could consider something like Valericom. Now, most nervine herbs are what we call dose dependent. So meaning at lower doses, they have a different effect than at higher doses. And it's kind of a spectrum, right? So lower doses, these are like antispasmodic and calming. And in higher doses, we're looking to be a bit more sedating. So you could, although this is like marketed as a sleep tonic, and again, you can use those higher doses to help you fall asleep. It can be used in lower doses throughout the day to calm things like anxiety or restlessness, nervousness, and just have that overall general calming to the nervous system. And ideally, what we're trying to avoid as well with sleep is this like drug-like or drowsy state that some sedative medications or alcohol, or for some people melatonin, where they find they're like super groggy in the morning and it's hard to kind of increase their energy in that vein. So just in consideration of dosing, like 2 mils 3 times a day. But if you're doing as like the full sleep aid, you can do up to like that full 6 mils. Again, throughout the day, you could use that as that drop dosing, and that would be supportive for that calming for the nervous system. Now, I had mentioned ashwagandha is helpful for GABA for maintaining that sleep architecture. Passion flower, valerian, and California poppy all work on GABA. So these are herbs that are really helpful for that sleep architecture. So meaning rather than knocking you out or sedating you, it's allowing your body to cycle through those natural sleep stages. So you get a deeper, more restorative, better quality sleep. Chamomile works on supporting the nervous system or calming the nervous system. That's like your quick action guy. Hops can be a bit more of a stronger sedative. And motherwort is also a really great anxiolytic, or again, kind of calming to the nervous system. And we have one for kids too. So Tilia Calm is kind of our children's version, or a tiny and mighty version of our Valericom. So this is also working on the nervous system. So calming children, experiencing anxiety or restlessness, or again, in those higher doses for sleep. And what's interesting is a lot of those nervine herbs are also really beneficial for digestion. So with gas and bloating or indigestion, it can be very supportive. And sometimes anxiety or stress dysregulation in kiddos is going to present as a stomach ache. So not only are you getting the benefit of like calming their digestion and supporting their digestion, we're working on the nervous system through their gut. So you get the benefit of both of those actions. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, but you should sugarcoat this. It's not the most tasty of formulas. So sometimes compliance with kiddos is a little bit challenging. So this could be part of your bedtime or wind down routine. You're doing this in hot water with a little bit of honey, or you're mixing it with some juice that you feel comfortable with, or a tea that you feel comfortable with. And this just has it. But you know what? Kids are remarkably resilient, and we need to give them a lot more credit to the things they'll try, because oftentimes they will they'll try it. They may not like it, but sometimes they're pretty good. Just baby bird it in their mouth, and they're fine. They move on. But again, this could be a consideration for kiddos as well. Okay. Oops, this code word is not, I didn't pull that from my previous presentation. So there's no code word needed, but if Johnny wants to kind of wrap things up, well, I have just to poke through the questions, and then anything that we need to say to people before they have to head out. Just want to be conscious of time. So Johnny, your last words, then I'll get into some questions.
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of questions waiting for you. There's like 27 or 28 in there right now. So just before we wrap up and get into the Q&A, just want to let everyone know a thank you for coming and joining us. If you head over to the Healthy Planet website, all our products are 15% off right now. So if there's any of the products that we talked about today, or any other products you're aware of, feel free to go to their website. Regarding the recording, I'm just going to post in the chat where to find it. You'll likely find that by the end of the week. It'll be on Healthy Planet's YouTube channel. And this is our last webinar with Healthy Planet for this calendar year. So Dr. Brianne and I will be back in 2024 in the new year with some new material. But just if there's any herbal topics that you would like us to discuss or review for next year, please pop it in the chat. We'd love to hear your feedback on any herbal topics or any conditions that you'd like us to focus on for next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. We love hearing what you want to learn about. Yeah, insulin resistance. That's so great. Yeah, pop your ideas in there. What I'm going to do is just turn off the recording for when I answer these questions. And then if just a note, because people are popping their suggestions in the chat, if your question is not in the Q&A box, I might miss it if it's not in the Q&A box, just because there's a lot more coming into the chat. So I'm going to stop recording.